Hello and welcome to Insight. In the last few years, we've seen a few incidents of extreme violence, all of them climaxing in Delhi. Are these just mere riots, or is there more to it? Or is this the new age of urban warfare? Me and Abhijit Iyer Mitra, an absolute expert on defense and security affairs, today will attempt at unraveling the multi-layers of these incidents of violence. Hi Abhijit, it is such a pleasure to have you with us on Insight. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, Rami.
And as you know, the subject for today's talk is the age of new urban warfare. So in that context, at the outset, could you explain to our viewers what is the conventional view of urban warfare?
Right. So the main thing about urban warfare is it's combat, as in heavy fighting, and the memory always goes back to Grozny, the Russian assault on Grozny, or Stalingrad or Leningrad, the German siege of Stalingrad or Leningrad, where you're offsetting the enemy's mobile power advantage in terms of tanks and things like that by dragging them into a city where they get bogged down. But it's obviously changed, like you brought out in your article, for example. Urban warfare now takes on a completely new connotation. The basic core of it, which is to negate an enemy's advantage, that still remains the core. It's just that the method has changed. It's still focused entirely on cities and all that cities possess: a educated elite, institutions of learning, institutions of information dissemination, which is to say newspapers and TVs and things like that. And you're using all of this in combination to negate the advantage of your enemy, who is constantly winning elections. So what you can't win through elections, you win back through manipulating a whole set of aggregated events around you.
Do you think this can now be applied to what we've seen happen in Delhi?
Absolutely. And mind you, it's not just an Indian phenomenon, it's a global phenomenon, where you've had the same thing happen with, say, Antifa and Black Lives Matter. They went on getting encouraged through a process of academic normalization, of essentially extorting corporates to support these movements financially, normalizing their violence in several ways, not just an academic normalization of violence, but also a journalistic normalization of violence. So, and that's what you see out here. The violence by the protesters during the CAA riots was completely whitewashed. Remember, the CAA riots, what we call the Delhi riots, were a continuum. They started off initially with the Seelampur riots and the violence at Jamia Millia. The moment they realized the police was going to crack down hard, they converted it to a pseudo-peaceful protest called Shaheen Bagh. And mind you, even that wasn't particularly lawful because they were taking and holding people hostage. Do you remember Gunja Kapoor was actually grabbed by them, manhandled by them, abused by them, and held hostage for a while before the police had to come and get her freed. And this also was glossed over and it was portrayed as peaceful, and then it metamorphosed into the Delhi riots when the opportunity arose. This was a complete continuum. But the problem is, if you read any of the newspapers or go to the archives of any news channels during that period, the overwhelming impression you get was that it was largely peaceful.
Not just in India, but internationally as well.
Exactly right. Again, with the farmer violence, right? You had a deliberate attempt, even though it was very clear that this tractor fellow had been trying to charge a police cordon, and he did it too fast and his thing capsized. They went out of their way to show that he was actually shot. Including quoting a foreign journalist, a foreign forensics expert, and they tried to portray it as a largely peaceful protest. The problem is that all these protests, they've been getting some level of support from abroad, foreign governments. There's also been, foreign bodies, be it Islamist bodies or Khalistani bodies out there. There has been an academic normalization of it. You actually had a major columnist call for violence in his column in the Indian Express, saying, this is what it needs to be. This is what the protest against the government of India needs to be. You've had all of it constantly normalized. You have a catch-all phrase called growing intolerance or rising fascism, not based on any kind of statistics, which is of course our own fault, because India is a very statistics poor country. The National Crime Records Bureau is almost inaccessible. You can't get access to most of these things. So it's what you call the perfect storm. It's an intersectionality of a lot of people with gripes coming together, essentially waging a low-level urban insurgency. And they are still not succeeding at the polls, so they succeed with the narrative.
So would you say that both these incidents fall into the basket of urban Naxalization?
They do, and I think we need to be careful, because the Naxals were essentially a rural movement, which is why we use the term urban Naxalization. Now remember, with Naxalism, a lot of the philosophy of Naxalism came from Mao Zedong's own writings. Mao Zedong was very clear that you have to create contradictions of purpose, as he calls them, wherein a government that is not essentially fascist or violent has to be provoked to the point where it cracks down on its own people, where its actions are made to turn violent against the people. And you can't do that except through graver and graver and graver provocations of the government through acts of violence. Correct. So all of this, it's taking on this, essentially what they're trying to do, if you look ahead, is create enough of a critical mass that it turns violent enough that the government cracks down violently. And essentially they want to trigger something like Tiananmen Square.
So they're provoking the government for a reaction. So how do you think then did our government handle both these incidents? Did it come across looking as a soft state?
Unfortunately,
or
it did.
Or a smart state?
I think they would have preferred to look smart, but they came off looking soft. Now, we have to separate two things. One is what other governments perceive and what the international press perceives. And these days, as it turns out, there's a huge gap between foreign government perception and foreign press perception, because the West itself is dealing, like I said, with a lot of these urban insurgency situations. So what the government did, essentially, what the Indian government did, was that, it had a very confused response. It was trying to both placate the foreign press in that sense, and sort of conflated the foreign press perception with the foreign government perception. If you remember, even when Article 370 was abrogated, where was the international criticism of it? The criticism came about because of an extended suspension of internet services and phone services in the valley. It wasn't the abrogation of 370 per se, except from Turkey, Malaysia and Pakistan, who, don't really count. And this is constantly turning out to be a problem. But there's a second aspect to this, which is, you need legal tools and law and order tools in order to defray these situations. And there's a whole set of those which the government simply isn't exploring.
So you think that this could have been looked at from the point of view of a law and order problem? Or just as that, or much more?
Much more than that. Because see, like you pointed out, the sedition laws were quite correctly used. The issue is, even the sedition laws in UAPA are not enough. You need to expand the scope, right? Because I'm all for this Brandenburg definition of incitement, which is, specific target, specific threat. Because that is very essential to protect our freedom of speech out here. But when you actually have support being given to acts of violence, what does that constitute? Or minimizing an act of violence, or being one-sided in ignoring acts of violence, there has to be some kind of accountability for it, number one. So our response has to be much bigger. There is a need for police reforms, there is a need for intelligence reforms, and that goes beyond WAPA. Let me give you an example. We were always taught in urban warfare and counterinsurgency that the battle is lost the moment the crowd has congregated. You win the battle before the crowd congregates. You can disperse it relatively easily when only 10, 15 people have gathered. But once 50 to 100 people have gathered, the perception game is lost out there. And perception is a very important part of counterinsurgency anyway. You can't be perceived to be soft, because that then encourages the malignant actors to become even more malignant. The response is, we can get away with it. The government doesn't know what it's doing. The second aspect to this is, the security that cops and law and order agencies themselves feel in taking on coercive measures.
Exactly.
Because what happens, like we've seen in Kashmir, is you can think out of the box to solve a problem, but then you'll immediately be scapegoated and thrown in jail or something like that. We don't have clear standards or procedures, and when standards and procedures do not exist, that is usually it's a clean sheet for authorities to abuse their power. So it's one of those very simple things, a clear set of standards and procedures which is applied consistently. Remember, the law is the law only when it is applied consistently. Law shorn of consistency is called tyranny. We don't do that. The third issue is one of narratives. Now, all long-lasting shifts of mindset have always involved a whole-scale eviction of the old elite and the introduction of a new elite. And that is something this government hasn't done in 7 years. The old elite are still in charge of the narrative building in Delhi. They haven't been kicked out, they haven't been replaced, and they still essentially, they're not getting more freebies from the government. So we spoke about the legal consequences of not having standard operating procedures. There are other issues as well, that we are a completely under-policed state. We have one of the lowest ratios of police to citizenry. In spite of, because we are a pre-industrial country, we have extremely high levels of societal violence, but it's low-level violence. We don't take that into account. We have a huge amount of judicial pendency, so even if you get punished, you probably won't get punished 30, 40 years down the line. So there's this whole set of problems. But then there's also the issue of investing in human beings. We don't invest in our cops, right? They're just given their basic exams, you pass your exams, and then you're given some basic training, given a stick, and put out on the street. Now, you can't deal with it that way. You need to have a comprehensive intelligence network. You need to have police stations that build local connections, where promotions are clearly thought out, where policemen and police officers just aren't shifted ad hoc from here to there. You have to build community relations to build a community network. You need to have proper electronic intelligence monitoring. You don't have a proper security network of cameras and things like that to give you early warning and assign blame. You don't equip your police properly in terms of non-lethal equipment as well. Tear gas very frequently malfunctions out here. We sometimes take these cut and paste options from the West which don't work. So for example, one of the things they found was, in Israel you get this perfectly normal liquid which is safe enough to drink, but it smells about 10 times worse than skunk residue. So they found that in Palestine, spraying them with this liquid, because it made them smell for like 2-3 weeks, their families would ostracize them and say, we don't want you in here. And curiously enough, when the same tests were conducted out here, it was found that the families had issues with the smell. So you can't take these cut-paste approaches from there. So there are a lot of things that we can do, which we don't do because we don't invest proactively in police. And even post facto, we don't sit back and do stock taking, because one of the things we hate as a society, I think, and it's a pan-India thing, is we never want to apportion blame and responsibility and accountability. We think it's somehow degrading.
They also say, you know, if your forces are equipped like the military, if they look like the military, if they feel like the military, like in some of these highly militarized states, they sort of react better to challenges. In this light, do you think that our government institutions need more sensitization to understand that, you know, this is the gap that they need to fill?
So it's two parts. One is they definitely need better equipment. On the other hand, when your standard operating procedures and your, the judicial system is too weak or too inconsistent, what happens is militarizing your police can actually lead to far greater abuses of power. So there's a very sweet spot in between. On one hand, you need to equip your police better. On the other, these steps that you take to equip the police itself act as a sort of check on them from going overboard. If you do something like a body camera, where he knows, the policeman knows it is going to be recorded, it will automatically act as a check and balance on him. He can have the absolute confidence that he will be backed up in a court of law, he will be backed up in any internal inquiry when he or she deals with a violent protester. And it will also prevent stories that keep coming out in the press. They also, bust narratives. We've seen this with the Israeli control of the West Bank and Gaza, where what used to happen was, the third intifada was nipped in the bud even before it realistically took off. And the third intifada was all about knives. It was taking knives and stabbing Israeli citizens. And what would happen is, at a border crossing, the moment something like this happened, the standard operating procedure was you shut that border crossing down. The threat has to be neutralized within 2 to 3 minutes, but the border crossing should open within 15 minutes. And within 15 minutes, what would happen is, because you would have the Hamas or the Palestinian side basically put out things saying this poor innocent man who was killed by Israeli forces, they immediately, there's a web handle, a Twitter handle called COGAT. It's the Occupation Authority for, it's a Hebrew acronym. But COGAT used to put out these videos showing clearly there was a knife attack and this guy was neutralized in an act of retaliation. So they aren't even able to win the narrative war on this. So it's good policing helps everything. It helps recruitment.
Correct.
It actually protects the citizenry against abuses. It also protects your police force against abuse of process and capriciousness on part of officers and law and order higher-ups.
Do you think that there is an ecosystem, a left ecosystem, an alliance that has almost created somewhat of a riot ideology?
Absolutely. Look, the left has always glorified this concept of, people's war. And people's war should only last till they come to power. After that, everything becomes illegal. If you look at, Communist Party, CPSU, so the Communist Party of the Soviet Union statements prior to coming to power in 1917, or at least consolidating power till 1920, it was all about freedom of religion, how our Central Asian brothers are being oppressed and so on and so forth. Once they come to power, they're wiping out of the very character of Central Asia is cultural genocide. When I went to Uzbekistan, I was at this madrasa in Bukhara built by Ulugh Beg, who is the grandson of Timur. And this, he saw me in a kurta pajama. It turned out he was one of the teachers at the madrasa. He calls me in because he wanted to have a chat with me. He hadn't seen an Indian tourist in Uzbekistan. He gives me vodka shots and smoked pork fat to smear on bread, sitting in a madrasa. Now, in India, the Turkic period is seen as a point of extreme religiosity and religious fanaticism. And in fact, if you go to the early period of the Russian conquest of Central Asia, the paintings by Vasily Vershagin, who accompanied this General von Kaufmann Turkestansky, all of it shows you an extremely fanatical society. And imagine within 150 years to go from there to having vodka shots in a madrasa.
Unbelievable.
That is the level of cultural wipeout that the Soviets did out there. So it's a very cynical game. They understand how to manipulate urban public opinion, turn it against the government, create urban insurgencies, impose these contradictions of purpose. And yes, it is a carefully calibrated game. Make no mistake about it. When you look at the kind of, what I would urge everyone to do who's watching this is to just make a list of editorials that were published during the riot period and see how many of them in some way normalize or completely ignore the violence carried out by the perpetrators.
Absolutely. I saw some articles where they were blatantly lying.
Absolutely. And if you ask them that, if you ask the editors, why did you publish this because this is one-sided, they will invariably end up saying, well, it's their opinion, it's their point of view, right? But if you want to write something equally one-sided, they'll be like, but see, that's factually incorrect.
Correct.
So facts end. So see, that is how narratives are manipulated. Nobody can archive, because nobody has the time to watch visual news.
Correct.
It is always, even now, it is writing that is the, if you look at academic referencing, you don't reference news clips, you always reference news articles.
Absolutely.
And that is what the historical memory is created with. So it's also a whitewashing of historical memory. It's sort of saturating academic literature with a one-sided point of view where you will be judged later on by history as the aggressor.
Absolutely. And I don't think the pro-Bharat ecosystem understands this. And I don't think they know how to really tackle it. Would you agree?
Absolutely. So there's several issues out here. One is the sort of intellectual laxity of the pro-Bharat side. Because see, they've grown up in a very Indic atmosphere. They don't know Western nuance or Western jargon
Correct.
to give that veneer of sophistication to their points.
Correct.
Mostly they tend to be in business. They actually have jobs, unlike the left, who have no jobs and their whole day is spent sloganeering.
Dissenting.
These people actually have to feed their families. Yes. So they have jobs, they've either done engineering or being a doctor or something like that, in which case there's a great fear that they'll get sacked from their jobs as well.
Correct.
Because they're not job providers, they're not job creators, they're kind of the employed. And the employee is always very susceptible to left extortion through their control of the narrative.
Correct.
So what ends up happening is that the pro-Bharat forces out here, even though they have a very solid case, neither have the articulation, nor the humanities education, nor the outlets, because of the squatting of the dispossessed elite on all the so-called credible media voices.
Correct.
To disseminate their point of view or the counter view.
What would you say that the government now needs to do to improve on the optics so that the right message goes out? Because India, like you said, surely isn't a benign state.
Right. So the first thing we need to understand is the division even within the government. So the government needs to understand everybody in this country who is non-left, who may not even agree with their point of view. Because remember, on the right, you have people like the Swarajya party, which was Rajaji's party, which was economically right. It was socially conservative.
Correct.
And then you have the RSS, which was socially progressive.
Yes.
It wasn't conservative at all, which was socially progressive and economically conservative. Today what you have is what we call, well, the institutional right that's in government is socialist economically and is adheres to some notion of Hindutva that can't really be categorized very clearly, because like Hindu temples still have not been emancipated. So what you have is, you first need to let go of the controls of the state on people's lives, right? This is number one. Number two, you have to replace the elite. This isn't an optional extra. There's this belief somehow that what the Times of India or Economic Times write today is irrelevant. And I used to think that for a long time. Economic Times, what is the circulation? Less than 100,000 copies. What is the circulation of the Times of India? Maybe 1 million copies. What's the circulation of the Hindu? Less than 80,000 copies. So they're irrelevant. They are not. What happens is, these English newspapers, even though their viewership and their readership is so low, they sort of give peer validation to everybody else. So everybody in the Hindi, Tamil, Bengali, Marathi media, they look up to the English media for validation of their own professional worth.
Absolutely.
So what happens is, a narrative that's created, and have you noticed with narratives, they start off with the economic English press, they move on to the so-called mainstream English press, and then they filter down into the so-called vernacular press. So you have to understand that the narrative building is so important in this. The state has coercive tools. If you notice, when the Congress comes to power, or in America when the Democrats come to power, they have no qualms about using state power. You look at when Gehlot and Kamal Nath came to power in Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh, the first thing they did was dismiss all the commissions and everybody appointed by the BJP. The BJP never does that. And it's quite strange because, when the BJP is voted into power, it is a vote for changing a whole mindset.
Absolutely.
And there is a national danger out here. Why? Because the so-called idea of India that we're obsessed with, Gandhi and Nehru, it's particularly dangerous as a national myth because you are confining a nation to one point in history based on opposition to one power. And what happens is 70, 80 years down the line, nobody is connected to that myth anymore, nobody is connected to that family anymore, nobody is connected to that philosophy anymore. So, countries like, say, America have a national philosophy that transcends time. It's, a fair go. You look at France or Germany, it's a linguistic identity.
Yes.
In India, what is your identity except that we all fought against the British together? This is where, see, the lack of humanities training, in-depth humanities training in the BJP is really beginning to show. It's sort of the Peter principle, I'm afraid to say. They've not really risen to the challenge of reforming the idea of India, and India really needs a recreation of that idea of India because the current idea of India is past its use by date.
Abhijit, it was absolutely fantastic to talk to you, and I think not just me but all our viewers are going to have so many things to think about. There's so many threads that we're going to be able to pull out of this, and I hope to see you back on The Insight very soon.
Thank you so much for having me, Rami. Great talking to you. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you.